So let's talk about background checks. Background checks we talk about how common are they. I put up a detail of a report of what an employer might get back if they were to ask a company to run a background check on their behalf. So right now, anecdotally, about 93% of employers conduct some type of background check when looking to hire employees. The number is incredibly high. Now that number, though, encompasses lots of different types of background checks. It's everything from a very thorough background check that someone might have to get security clearances for and run an FBI record, and multiple different databases are accessed, to what we call an organic search, which is where somebody just hops on the computer, accesses a court's website, and then looks up someone's record on their own. A lot of the sort of mom and pop independent businesses, for example, will sometimes conduct free organic searches, as we call them, rather than hiring a private data harvesting company to perform that background check for them. But as I said, anecdotally, about 93% of employers these days run some type of background check. Volunteer associations. So in my practice, I get calls from people, obviously, who are looking to clean up their criminal record after they've had some sort of experience or something where their record has been holding them back. And I often ask them, what types of difficulties have you been experiencing? And I ask them what their goals are as well. Sometimes their goals are misaligned with the relief that they're asking for. So I always want to make sure to see what types of problems are they having, what are their goals? And a lot of what I hear is, of course, the employment arena is paramount. I mean, that's the biggest thing for people. But I also hear issues where they have problems with volunteering. So someone wants to be a chaperone for their son or daughter's field trip, and they have to go through a background check at the school, and they know that they have something on their record, and so they're very frightened to go through that process. Sometimes they won't even try for fear of embarrassing their child, something coming up, people in the school system now knowing about some unfortunate incident that's happened in their past, and they just don't want to go there. And I've had other people who have frankly been denied. They have gone through the process, and the school has said, no, I'm sorry, you can't chaperone. I've had calls from people who say, I was initially denied, but the school is allowing me to come along as a guest, so to speak, rather than official chaperone. But the point is, there's these processes in place, and, I think many people would argue that that's a good thing. But there's these processes in place to sort of screen applicants for all sorts of things these days. Another one, for example, is to volunteer to be a big brother, big sister, any kind of mentor person. And again, I'm somebody who obviously understands the wisdom of making sure that we're screening people and that they're in appropriate positions. But also, too, I see the day-to-day issues that crop up in people's lives, offenses that really are either very, very old or don't relate in any way to harming, children on a field trip or a mentee or that type of thing, and they want to be able to get past this, and they should. They can demonstrate rehabilitation. So volunteer associations are another one these days. Landlords, that's probably the second biggest issue that crops up, is people who are looking for housing. Apartments obviously are the biggest one. It doesn't have to be apartments, though. There are people who I know who have been approved for mortgages or not, and the companies will look into their criminal history, for example. And so it can come up with regard to housing issues. As I mentioned, I think employment and housing probably, in my practice anyway, cover about 90% of what I deal with, the obstacles that people are trying to overcome. There's other things, too, with regard to creditors. People are increasingly seeking additional information about the people that they're dealing with in their day-to-day lives, their day-to-day business. And so creditors are oftentimes getting this information, too, to figure out someone's situation. Insurance companies are using this information these days to do risk assessment and to determine premiums for people, whether it's car insurance, whether it's homeowners insurance. And so you have a lot of data about people these days, and it's becoming, again, increasingly accessible. So they did a poll, and actually the numbers here, there was about 347. So this isn't a huge sample. There's some notes on the presentation about where this information, these statistics are coming from, and the numbers involved. But essentially it says in 2012 there were 17 million background checks conducted in the United States for licensing and employment purposes. I have to believe that that number is higher now. I don't have a recent number. But the point is there's a great deal. I mean, that's thousands and thousands of background checks being conducted each day. So there's a graph here that talks about how do you conduct criminal background checks for any job candidates in working in a company. And I'm going to get a bit more into the employment side of things here for a moment. But so it says for all job candidates, that's the green color on this graph, 73% of employers will conduct background checks for all job candidates, regardless of the position. 19% is for selected job candidates, so they obviously pick and choose who is required to conduct a background check or what positions they want a background check conducted for. And then 7% says, no, my organization does not conduct a background check for this type of, from our job candidates. So again, you can see the prevalence of background checks for employment purposes. Based on that information, they also asked how influential is or would be the discovery of each of the following in your decision not to extend a job offer to someone. And of course, I talk to people and they always say to me, they're worried, even if something is very minor, even if it's just an arrest on their record and the person was never formally charged. The problem is that if you have two candidates who are otherwise equal and an employer is trying to decide who to hire, a lot of times that one small blip, that one thing that makes a small difference will be enough to cost someone the job. And so when you look on here, these numbers bore that out. Essentially the top talks about, on the left-hand side of the column, it talks about different types of offenses and how influential having a record related to that type of offense or that type of record would be in influencing an employer to hire someone or not. And so up in the very top, they've talked about, someone convicted of a violent felony. So for example, murder, rape, etc. Of course, 95% of employers said that would be very influential in their decision to hire someone or not. 5% said it would be somewhat influential. But if you go to the very bottom of this, and we go down the line here, and it talks about, someone convicted of a nonviolent felony, a financial crime, fraud, theft, embezzlement, credit card transaction fraud, those types of offenses. Again, you see, though, 75% of employers would say that was very influential in their decision to hire someone or not. I see in my practice that theft offenses are probably the #1 thing that cost people employment. I see a lot of offenses that are financial related where, of course, employers have red flags. I think the #1 thing that employers are often worried about is in offenses such as theft that indicate sometimes character to them. They don't want employees, obviously, to steal from them. In any employment situation, employers are generally worried about loss and employee theft. And so that's a very big one. So moving down the line, we talk about convicted of a violent misdemeanor level offense. So, for example, domestic assault or some type of bar fight or assault that might be a misdemeanor in that jurisdiction. And then we talk about convicted of nonviolent misdemeanor offenses. So things, again, like shoplifting or, your criminal damage to property, that's a misdemeanor. And then at the very bottom, I find this graphic to be particularly interesting. It says, arrest records that did not result in a conviction. So obviously there's multiple layers of records that are kept. When someone is initially arrested, oftentimes the booking process, the fingerprinting and the photographing of someone is their first contact with the criminal justice system when it comes to records. So there's the booking process, which creates an arrest record. Beyond that, then it moves into someone being formally charged with an offense. Now a court will have a record related to that. A prosecutor will have records related to this. And the whole process will start with having an active pending case. Beyond that, then, it gets to the point where the person may or may not be convicted. There's some type of court disposition. If the person's convicted, that conviction is also often relayed to a number of databases that will keep that information. Probation, for example, is another one. If someone is put on probation, probation departments have records related to that particular disposition and how that person then does subsequently on their probation. So when we're talking about the very bottom line on this graph, it talks about arrest records that did not result in a conviction. So of this, though, 5% of employers said that would be very influential in their decision to hire someone or not. And as you know, in our criminal justice system, there's the presumption of innocence. People are presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty by the state. And so for these people, if they're being arrested for something but it doesn't result in a conviction, This graph really demonstrates that that can still have a very, very real impact on someone. Another thing I hear a lot is people call me up and they say, you know, I went to court and they told me that this wouldn't be on my record, it would be dismissed, or I'm being put in a diversion program. Why is this still showing up on a background check? They told me that this wouldn't be on my record. And I have to oftentimes explain the difference between saying this is not on your criminal record as a conviction versus saying it doesn't mean that there's no record of it. We, again, live in this age where there's tons of records about what someone is arrested for, what they're charged with, what dates they go to court. And so in this day and age, even an arrest record can have a significant impact and can show up on background checks. So on this graph, another 26% said it would be somewhat influential in their decision to hire someone. We're talking about just arrest records. Another 32% said it would be not very influential, and then 37% said that it would not be influential at all. But again, there's still a good chunk of about 30%, 31% of people that say that that would have an influence on their decision to hire someone. So often I get asked, how will this affect me in the future? How do these records affect me? One thing that I have to tell people is that it's extremely difficult to really put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, after someone has gone through the criminal justice system and has some type of record related to that. In my experience, various states have different processes for cleaning up criminal records. And again, in Minnesota, where I practice, the expungements generally are very effective. But there's really never any complete guarantee that this record is not going to follow you through. I'll talk a little bit later in this program about some of the ways that records can still exist even after a very thorough and effective expungement, or even after some other process that will help people restore a clean criminal history. So it's just, there's never really any guarantee, 100% guarantee that this record is not going to be out there. So certain kinds of charges and conviction obviously bar employment in certain types of industries. Banking is a very big one. I've had clients who have received an expungement of an offense for which they were never convicted, and the banking institution frankly does not care. They already know that the person has this on their record. The fact that they've now later gotten an expungement doesn't rehabilitate that person in their eyes. So some industries can be very, very restrictive, and even despite an expungement can still decline to hire somebody. Another issue that comes up is when someone gets an expungement, they often ask me, how do I answer questions about my criminal history in the future, whether it's on an application or whether it's something involving an interview situation. And a lot of times I have to advise the client as to the process that they've gone through, what it actually legally does. So if you've got an expungement in Minnesota, for example, it will steal the records from public view and remove them from these databases, but it does not reverse a conviction. And so clients are left in the lurch sometimes of trying to figure out how to answer these questions if asked. If someone says to them, have you ever been convicted of something, but it's been expunged, they're left with sort of the back and forth about saying, well, is this person going to find out about it? Do I at least give myself a chance and not mention it? Later explain that if it does come up, I didn't mention it because it was expunged. Or, truthfully, the answer is yes, there still is a conviction that remains there. The employer may not be able to see it, but it is technically, legally still a conviction. So there's different issues that crop up. So positions that are regulated by government agencies, for example, is another issue. Government agencies oftentimes have greater access to records than what the public does or what a private employer does. And so immigration concerns, for example, a lot of times if you're dealing with an expungement that just seals records and does not reverse a conviction, immigration officials can still access that information as a government official. Law enforcement, when people apply to become a law enforcement officer, again, there's a real thorough vetting of these people generally, and law enforcement agencies can and will get access to information that may not be available to the public and may not be available following an expungement. Trucking and DOT regulated positions, so Department of Transportation, anybody who needs to get special clearance, security clearances, hazmat clearance, for example, a lot of times records, despite an expungement, can still be something that they will have to disclose. School employment, people working with children, certain licensure. So there's all kinds of different issues with regard to the scope of the records and what an expungement will actually do. And again, this is going to come down to really state-specific information. I would encourage people practicing in this area to really take a good look at processes available in your particular state, to understand what that process functionally does, and to understand then the scope of the records, where the records are going to be kept, what agencies it will apply to, what agencies it may not apply to. I know that, for example, in Minnesota, if you get an expungement, you have to name each agency you want it to apply to. If you forget to name certain agencies, for example, that agency will not have to abide by records and may still be able to get access to them. So if your client has profession-specific concerns, I would also recommend talking to an employment lawyer. A lot of times if you can find a good employment lawyer in your state who has dealt with issues of criminal records, background checks, cleaning up criminal records, what to do when a person has had an expungement or some other type of record removal, what that means legally for them in an employment setting. Because again, employment is usually the biggest issue for people. So it may help to talk to an employment lawyer. There also might be things that can be done on the front end when a client goes to court, dealing with some sort of plea agreement or plea deal that can help make life easier for them. I've been known to sort of do, I don't want to call it guerrilla tactics, but different types of tactics in order to really protect people moving forward. For example, if I have a client who has multiple charges and the prosecutor is saying, I will agree to dismiss the more serious charge if the person pleads guilty to the lesser charge, oftentimes what I will do is amend the top more serious charge to the exact same offense as the lesser charge and then have them plead guilty to that. What I've done is effectively write over the court record, write over the more serious offense. So if someone looks at my client's record, instead of it saying very serious offense, dismissed, lesser offense, guilty, convicted, now it'll just have the two lesser offenses there, and it will say convicted of one of them, the other is dismissed. A lot of prosecutors don't care. It's nothing to them. They've essentially agreed that the case should be resolved with the lesser charge. But it's little things that I can do to help my client move forward and not to have this criminal record hinder them, especially when we're talking about a case or a charge that's dismissed, especially in a situation where that charge may not have been warranted.